What if I told you that the story of the Bible's most powerful prophet isn't really about the miracles of fire and rain? What if I told you it's actually a story about burnout, about the paralyzing fear of failure, and about finding God not in the earthquake, but in the utter silence of your own broken soul? Over the next 30 minutes, you will not just hear the story of Elijah, you will feel it. We will deconstruct the moments you think you know to uncover the shocking humanity, the vulnerability, and the stunning relevance of this man for your life today. Stay with me, and I promise you will never read Elijah the same way again. Welcome to the Faith and Hope channel. Today, you and I embark on a journey, not just back in time, but deep into the heart of one of the giants of the faith. The story of Elijah is so often presented as a highlight reel of spectacular victories, a divine highlight reel. But that, my friend, is merely the surface. Beneath the miracles that shook a nation lies a narrative far deeper and, frankly, far more like our own. It is the story of a man who felt utterly alone, who faced crippling anxiety and depression, and who had to learn that God's power is made perfect in ways he never expected. To truly understand Elijah's ascent to Mount Carmel, we must first descend into the dark and shadowy valley into which Israel had sunk. The 9th century before Christ was not just a different time. It was a world in spiritual crisis. The nation chosen by God, the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was at a perilous crossroads, seduced by a darkness that threatened to extinguish the light of Yahweh forever. The king on the throne was Ahab, a man the scriptures describe as doing more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings before him. But Ahab, in all his moral weakness and political compromise, was not the driving force behind this decay. The true architect of Israel's apostasy was his wife, a woman whose name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation, Jezebel. As the daughter of the king of the Sidonians, she was not merely a foreign queen, she was a fervent missionary for her pagan faith. She brought with her not just her customs, but the entire pantheon of Phoenician gods, with Baal, the god of the storm and fertility, as the central figure. Imagine the scene in a land promised to a single, invisible, and holy God. Opulent temples, smoking altars, and sensual, at times depraved, rituals dedicated to Baal and Asherah suddenly spring up. Jezebel was not interested in syncretism or peaceful coexistence. Her policy was one of eradication. She initiated a systematic and brutal persecution, hunting down and executing the prophets of the Lord. The worship of Yahweh was driven underground. True worship became an act of rebellion, punishable by death. It is into this landscape of darkness, compromise, and fear that our story begins, not with an angel or a grand vision, but with the abrupt appearance of a man from nowhere, a Tishbite named Elijah. Who was he? Where did he come from? The Bible is deliberately silent, adding to the mystery. He simply emerges, as if torn from the wild land of Gilead itself. A rugged man, clothed in skins, with a message as harsh and unyielding as the landscape he hailed from. His first appearance is not a sermon, not a call to repentance. It is a declaration of war, a direct affront not just to King Ahab, but to the new god of Israel, Baal. Have you ever felt as though you were fighting a losing battle, as if the culture around you was moving in a direction that contradicts everything you believe? It is precisely at this point of tension that Elijah steps onto the stage. And it is why his story begins with such raw and resonant power. He did not ask for permission. He simply stood before power and declared a truth that would change the course of the nation. Elijah's first appearance on the stage of biblical history is one of the most dramatic and abrupt introductions of any character in Scripture. Let us immerse ourselves in this scene, using our imagination to fill in the sensory details that the concise text suggests. Picture the throne room of King Ahab in Samaria. Forget humble depictions. This was a palace built with the help of Phoenicia, Jezebel's nation, renowned for its wealth and craftsmanship. The air would have been heavy, with the cloying scent of expensive incense burning in homage to foreign deities, the sweet and sickening aroma of Baal and Asherah. The floor, perhaps of polished stone, would reflect the light of flickering torches in bronze sconces. Ivory, imported and expertly carved, would adorn the furniture and the walls, a testament to Ahab's wealth and power. The king himself would be reclining on his throne, dressed in fine linen and purple, the colors of royalty, surrounded by his advisors and guards. At his side, or perhaps looming nearby with a silent intensity, would be Jezebel, her dark eyes observing everything, the true force behind the throne. The sound would be a murmur of courtly conversation, the clinking of goblets, the soft music of a harp played in a corner. It was a world of power, opulence, and self-confidence. And then the door opens. In walks a man who is the antithesis of everything in this room, Elijah. He wears not fine linen but a cloak of animal hair, likely coarse and smelling of the wilderness, cinched with a leather belt. His hair and beard are long and wild, not trimmed and perfumed like the courtiers. His skin is weathered by the sun and wind of Gilead, a rugged, untamed region east of the Jordan. He does not walk with the calculated deference of one seeking favor. He strides forward with an unbending purpose. The murmur in the room ceases, the harps fall silent, all eyes turn to this wild apparition. He does not address the advisors, he does not bow before the queen. His eyes lock onto Ahab, and he speaks. His voice is not a whisper but a proclamation, loud and clear, cutting through the perfumed air like a blade. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Let us analyze the audacity of this. He does not say, God will do this. He says it will not rain except at my word. He positions himself as God's agent, the gate through which divine power will either flow or be withheld. More importantly, he is throwing down a direct challenge to Baal. Baal was the storm god, the rider of the clouds, the deity who supposedly brought the rain and ensured the fertility of the land. The economy, the food, the very life of the nation depended on the rain. By declaring a drought in the name of Yahweh, Elijah was effectively saying, "Your God, Baal, whom you trust for your prosperity, is impotent. The true God, the God of Israel, whom you have abandoned, is the one who controls the heavens, and to prove it, he is turning off the tap." This was not just a weather forecast, it was a theological declaration of war. It was a direct assault on Jezebel's power base and the foundation of the new state religion. Imagine the shock, the anger, perhaps even the derision on the faces of Ahab and Jezebel. Who was this man from the wilderness to make such a proclamation? And then, as abruptly as he arrived, he is gone. He does not wait for a reply. He does not engage in debate. He delivers the word of God and vanishes, leaving behind a stunned silence and a sentence hanging over the land. What kind of faith does it take to stand before the most dangerous power structure of your day with a message so defiant? Think of a time in your life when you had to stand for an unpopular truth. What did you feel in that moment? Fear, courage, a mixture of both. It is in that tension that we find the heart of Elijah's ministry. After such an explosive declaration, the logical reaction of a tyrannical regime like Ahab's and Jezebel's would be swift and lethal, to hunt down and silence the prophet. God, knowing the danger, acts first. The instruction to Elijah is as counterintuitive as his previous proclamation. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. Think about this. From the center of power, from the national stage, Elijah is sent into total obscurity. From confrontation, he is sent into isolation. This is the first great lesson in Elijah's journey of transformation, and it is one that resonates deeply with us. So often, after a great spiritual effort or an act of courage, we expect acclaim or at least the next great assignment. Instead, God often calls us into a period of silence, of hiddenness, of dependency. It is the Kerith moment. Let us paint the sensory scene of this place. The Kerith ravine would not be a mighty river, but likely a wadi, a valley or ravine that only had water during the rainy season. The Hebrew word kerith means a cutting or a separation. Elijah was literally cut off from the world. Imagine the scenery. The rocky walls of the wadi rising up on either side, creating a sense of being sealed off from the outside world. The constant soft sound of water running over stones would be his only musical companion. The Middle Eastern sun would beat down on the canyon rims, but at the bottom, where Elijah was, there would be shade and relative cool. The smell would be of damp earth, of rock heated by the sun, and of the vegetation that clung to the stream's banks. During the day, the silence would be broken only by the drone of insects or the distant call of a bird. At night, the sky would be a tapestry of impossibly bright stars, unobscured by the light pollution of cities or towns. Here, stripped of an audience, of adulation, and of visible purpose, Elijah had to learn to depend on God in a radical new way. God's promise was specific. "You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." The water was the easy part to believe, for it was there, flowing before him. But the ravens, in Levitical law, ravens were unclean birds. They were scavengers associated with death and filth. God's choice of this particular messenger is profoundly significant. He was teaching Elijah that his provision can come from the most unexpected and, by human standards, unclean sources. He was breaking down Elijah's pride and his preconceptions. Every morning and every evening, Elijah, the great prophet, had to wait humbly for these unclean birds to bring him his daily sustenance, bread and meat. Picture the scene. The distinct sound of flapping wings, the hoarse caw growing closer, Elijah looking up, seeing the dark silhouettes against the blue sky, and the ravens dropping the food near him. This daily ritual taught Elijah a foundational lesson about God's provision. It is faithful, it is sufficient for the day, and it often defies our expectations and categories. How many times in our lives do we pray for provision and expect it to come in a neat, clean package from a source we deem worthy? And how often does God surprise us, sending help through people or circumstances we would never have chosen, forcing us to lay down our pride and simply receive? This period at Kerith was Elijah's desert university. It was where he learned that his worth was not in his public pronouncements or his miraculous acts, but in his quiet, dependent communion with God. It was a time of stripping away, where the noise of the world was silenced so that he could learn to hear God's voice more deeply. But this sanctuary was not permanent. The very power he had invoked upon the nation, the drought, would eventually affect him personally. The brook began to shrink. The trickle became a drip, and the drip finally ceased. The tool of his training was drying up, forcing him to trust God, not just for his next meal, but for his next instruction. The lesson of Kerith was complete. He had learned dependence. Now, God would move him to an even more unlikely place to teach him about faith. With the brook Kerith now dry, Elijah's faith is tested anew. The provision he had come to know, the daily rhythm of water and raven-delivered bread, has ended. This is a moment we can relate to so deeply. That season of life when a method, a relationship, or a source of security that God has used to sustain us simply dries up. It is disorienting and frightening. God's instruction to Elijah is, once again, shocking and counterintuitive. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." Let us break down the geography and theology of this command. Zarephath was not in Israel. It was deep in the heart of enemy territory. It belonged to Sidon, the homeland of none other than Queen Jezebel, the architect of the persecution of Yahweh's prophets. It was the very epicenter of Baal worship. God was sending his most wanted prophet to hide in plain sight, right under the nose of the enemy, in the homeland of his greatest adversary. It is a stunning display of God's sovereignty and, we might dare say, his sense of irony. But the instruction gets even stranger. Who has God chosen to sustain his prophet? Not a wealthy, secret sympathizer of Yahweh, not a powerful merchant. He has chosen the most vulnerable person in ancient Near Eastern society, a Gentile widow, a woman with no husband, no social standing, no legal protection, and as Elijah would soon discover, no resources. She was the epitome of powerlessness. Elijah's journey from Kerith to Zarephath would have been perilous. He would be traveling through a land ravaged by the drought he himself had proclaimed. The land would be parched and dusty. The crops would have failed. The animals would be dying. There would be famine, desperation, and undoubtedly anger directed at this mysterious prophet who was rumored to have caused it all. He would have had to travel in disguise, in fear of being recognized. Finally, he arrives at the gates of Zarephath. The city, though coastal and part of wealthy Phoenicia, would also be feeling the effects of the drought. He sees a woman gathering sticks. The image is one of abject poverty. She's not chopping firewood. She's picking up the smallest bits of wood she can find. Elijah's faith must have been tested. "This is the woman God sent to sustain me?" He approaches her with a simple yet bold request in a time of drought. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she turns to go, he raises the stakes, testing the command of God. "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." Her response is one of the most moving passages in the entire Old Testament. She does not get angry at the audacious request from a stranger. She simply states her desperate situation with heartbreaking honesty. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she says, ironically swearing by Elijah's God, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This is the face of absolute despair. She is not just out of food, she is preparing her very last meal. She has resigned herself to the fact that she and her son are going to starve to death. It is at this point of total hopelessness that Elijah delivers one of the most challenging words of faith in the Bible. He does not offer pity, he offers a divine promise. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." What an unbelievable request. Give me your last meal, the final thing standing between you and death, and trust that God will provide. He is asking her to act in faith before she sees the provision. The lesson of Kerith was about Elijah's dependence. The lesson of Zarephath is about him catalyzing faith in someone else. He is being used by God, not just to be fed, but to bring a miracle into the life of this desperate woman. Have you ever been in a position where giving the little you had seemed like the most illogical thing in the world? Yet it is precisely in those moments of sacrificial faith that God often works his deepest miracles, not just for us, but through us for others. The choice was before the widow: cling to what she could see, the handful of flour, or cling to the promise she could not see. Her decision would change everything. The widow of Zarephath's response to Elijah's seemingly outrageous request is a quiet testament to the power of desperate faith. The text does not tell us that she debated, argued, or hesitated. It simply says she went away and did as Elijah had told her. Let us pause and absorb the profundity of this act. She, a Gentile who likely knew Yahweh only by name, chose to trust the word of the God of Israel, spoken by this strange prophet, over the evidence of her own eyes, the nearly empty jar and jug. She took her last handful of flour, her last drop of oil, and she made a small loaf of bread for Elijah first. This act of sacrificial obedience unleashed the power of God in a continuous, sustaining way. The miracle that followed was not a one-time spectacular event. It was not a barn that magically filled up overnight. It was a domestic, daily, quiet miracle. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Imagine the daily routine in this small home. Every morning, the widow would go to her clay jar with a feeling that must have been a mixture of apprehension and awe. She would dip a hand or a scoop into the flour, expecting to feel the bottom, yet there was always enough for that day's bread. She would tilt the jug of oil, expecting only the last drop to emerge, yet there was always enough to mix the dough and light her lamp. It was not an overflow, it was not abundance, it was sufficiency. It was the provision of daily bread in its most literal form. This miracle taught a profound lesson to both Elijah and the widow. For the widow, it taught her that the God of Israel was real and cared for the destitute, even a Gentile woman outside the covenant. For Elijah, it was an even deeper lesson. At Kerith, he was the passive recipient of God's provision. At Zarephath, he was an active participant in someone else's miracle. He saw how faith, even small and desperate faith, could become a conduit for God's sustaining power. He learned that God was not just interested in grand national showdowns, but in the quiet sustenance of a small family in a pagan city. This period of tranquility and divine provision was, however, brutally interrupted by any parent's greatest fear. The widow's son, the very boy for whom she was preparing the last meal, fell ill. The sickness progressed rapidly, and finally, he stopped breathing. He was dead. The widow's grief turned into a bitter accusation aimed at Elijah. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her pain is raw and understandable. In the theology of the time, misfortune was often seen as a direct punishment for sin. She must have thought, "I was at peace in my misery, ready to die. You came, gave me hope, showed me the power of your God, and now he takes the one thing I had left. Was it all a trick to punish me for some past sin?" This crisis shakes Elijah to his core. This was not the plan. The God who miraculously provides food does not then take away life, does he? Elijah's response is not defensive. He does not offer theological platitudes. He feels her pain and he acts. "Give me your son," he says. He takes the dead boy from his mother's arms and carries him to the upper room where he was staying. This is an incredibly intimate and desperate moment. Alone with the lifeless body of the child, Elijah cries out to God with an honesty that borders on accusation. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" This is the cry of a man whose faith is being stretched to the breaking point. He does not understand what God is doing. Have you ever felt that way? When tragedy strikes and it seems to contradict everything you know about God's goodness? What do you do when prayer seems to be met with a devastating silence? Elijah doesn't give up. He stretches himself out on the boy, body to body, 3 times. This bizarre physical act is one of desperate identification, a pouring out of his own life in an attempt to rekindle the boy's. And he cries out, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." What happens next elevates Elijah's ministry to a whole new level, foreshadowing the miracles of Christ himself. In the upper room of the modest house in Zarephath, we find Elijah at his most vulnerable and simultaneously his most audacious. Faced with the lifeless body of the widow's son, he is not performing a rehearsed ritual. There is no manual for raising the dead. This is new and terrifying territory. His cry to God, "Have you brought tragedy even on this widow?" is not a sign of a lack of faith, but of a deep, relational faith. It is the faith that dares to question, to wrestle with God in the midst of pain and confusion. It is the kind of brutal honesty that God not only tolerates but seems to invite. Picture the cinematic scene, the small room, perhaps lit only by a sliver of light from a window or the flame of an oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The silence is heavy, broken only by Elijah's ragged breathing and his anguished cry. He stretches himself over the child's cold body. Once, twice, 3 times. This threefold act, echoing completeness and intensity in Hebraic numerology, is an act of total desperation and total faith. It is as if he is trying to transfer his own life force, his own warmth, his own soul into the boy, while pleading with God to do what only God can do. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Imagine that moment. The first shuddering gasp of the boy, a flutter of the eyelids, a movement. The color returning to his face, life in defiance of death, flooding back into his body at the command of the Creator. Elijah wastes no time in celebration. He takes the boy, now alive and breathing, and carries him downstairs to his mother. He does not say, "I did this." He does not say, "Look how powerful I am." He simply says, "Look, your son is alive." The widow's response marks the climax of her own faith journey. Her earlier accusation, born of grief, dissolves into a declaration of absolute certainty. She focuses not just on the miracle of her son's life, but on the identity of the man who was the channel for it. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Before, she called him man of God with sarcasm and pain. Now she declares it with conviction. Before, she obeyed his word as an act of desperate faith. Now she knows that his word is the very truth of God. This event was transformative for everyone involved. For the widow and her son, it was the restoration of life and the solidification of faith. But what did it mean for Elijah? This miracle pushed him beyond anything he had ever experienced. He had manipulated the weather, been fed by ravens, witnessed the multiplication of food, but now he had been God's instrument in reversing death itself. He learned that God's power was not just for national sustenance or bodily provision, but for the redemption of life itself. This prepared him for the confrontation to come. If God could defeat death in a quiet upper room, surely he could defeat the prophets of a dead God on a public mountain. This miracle solidified in his soul the truth that there is no power, not even death, that can stand against the Lord Yahweh. So often in our own lives, God allows us to face impossible situations, not to crush us, but to show us a dimension of his power we would never know otherwise. What has been your Zarephath resurrection? A moment when a situation that seemed completely dead, a relationship, a career, a hope, was brought back to life in a way that could only be God's work. These are the moments that forge in us the unshakable conviction that the word of the Lord in our mouths and in our hearts is indeed the truth. With this new, profound certainty, Elijah's time in exile was nearing its end. The period of training in the silence of Kerith and the domestic faith of Zarephath was complete. The drought had now lasted 3 long, devastating years. The land was exhausted. The people were desperate. It was time for the final showdown. The word of the Lord came to Elijah again. "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." The show was about to begin. The Lord's command to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab," marks a dramatic turning point in the narrative. The years of hiding and quiet training are over. It is time to step back into the center of the storm. Elijah's journey back into Israel is a journey into the heart of devastation. The land he left, green though spiritually sick, was now physically dying. The 3-year drought, a testament to the power of God's word through Elijah, had taken its toll. Imagine the landscape. Fields that once waved with barley and wheat were now expanses of brown dust. Olive groves and vineyards, symbols of Israel's life and blessing, were withered and grey. The riverbeds were scars of cracked earth. The livestock, the wealth of the people were perishing. Famine was no longer a threat, it was a brutal, daily reality. Despair hung in the air as thick as the dust. Amid this national crisis, we find King Ahab. He is on a desperate search, not for God, not for repentance, but for something far more pragmatic: grass. He and his palace administrator, a righteous man named Obadiah, have divided the land between them to search for any source of water or pasture that might save what was left of their horses and mules. This small vignette reveals the state of Ahab's heart. The kingdom is collapsing, the people are starving, yet his primary concern is the preservation of his cavalry animals, the symbols of his military power and status. He is blind to the spiritual cause of his affliction. It is here that a fascinating encounter occurs. Obadiah, who secretly feared God and had hidden and fed 100 of the Lord's prophets in caves during Jezebel's persecution, runs into Elijah. Obadiah's reaction is one of absolute terror. He falls on his face and asks, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" He knows who Elijah is and what he represents. Obadiah's fear is twofold. He fears the wrath of Ahab, who has been searching for Elijah throughout the known world, and he fears the supernatural power of Elijah. He is afraid that if he goes to tell Ahab he has found Elijah, the Spirit of the Lord might whisk Elijah away to an unknown place, something that was apparently known to happen, leaving Obadiah to face the wrath of a frustrated king, which would mean certain death. Their conversation gives us a glimpse into the paranoia and danger of the times. Elijah, however, is resolute. He reassures him with an oath, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." Elijah's courage is now fully forged. The man who fled and hid now marches toward his enemy. The final meeting between Elijah and Ahab is charged with tension. When Ahab sees Elijah, his first word is an accusation. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" It is a classic case of blame shifting. Ahab, the king who led the nation into apostasy and thus into ruin, blames the prophet who pointed out the sin. Elijah's response is one of the most direct and courageous rebukes in the Bible. He does not flinch. He throws the accusation right back, placing the blame exactly where it belongs. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." And then Elijah the fugitive takes command. He does not ask for an audience. He demands a convocation. He tells Ahab to summon all of Israel to Mount Carmel, and not just the people, but also the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. He is laying the groundwork for an epic, public, and definitive confrontation. The stage is being set. Mount Carmel, a lush mountain range jutting into the Mediterranean, was ironically known for its greenery and was a sacred site for Baal, the god of fertility. Elijah is choosing the enemy's home turf for the final battle. The question is no longer about whether it will rain. The question is now much bigger. Who is God, Yahweh or Baal? The stage is set for the most dramatic power demonstration in the Old Testament. What kind of courage arises in you when you know you are acting not in your own strength, but under a direct divine commission? Think of the confidence Elijah exhibits here. It is the culmination of Kerith and Zarephath, a confidence born not of arrogance, but of intimacy with the God who provides, who resurrects, and who now sends him into battle. Mount Carmel becomes the stage for the ultimate theological showdown. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Israelites, their faces etched with hunger and uncertainty, making their way up the slopes of the mountain. The air is heavy, not with moisture, but with a palpable tension. On one side stands a solitary figure, Elijah, the prophet of Yahweh, his face weathered by the desert, his eyes burning with a holy intensity. On the other side, an army of religious and political power, the 450 prophets of Baal, dressed in the vestments of their office, confident in their numbers and royal patronage. The 400 prophets of Asherah, the queen's favorites, are also likely present, though the focus of the contest will be Baal. Elijah steps forward to the people, and his first question is a sharp knife that cuts directly to the heart of their compromise. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. The verb to waver or to limp is vivid. He is accusing them of trying to walk with one foot on the path of Yahweh and one foot on the path of Baal, resulting in an unstable and ineffective spiritual walk. He is forcing them to make a choice. The people's response is a resounding silence. They have nothing to say. It is the silence of guilt, confusion, and fear. Seeing their hesitation, Elijah proposes a test, an irrefutable scientific theological experiment. The proposal is simple and fair. 2 offerings, 2 bulls, 2 altars, one for Baal, one for Yahweh. The prophets of Baal will prepare their offering, but they will not set fire to it. Elijah will do the same. Then you call on the name of your God, Elijah says, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. The proposal is brilliant for several reasons. First, it is public. Everyone will be a witness. There will be no room for doubt or rumor. Second, it plays directly into Baal's claimed strength. As the god of the storm, fire, lightning, was his domain. Elijah is giving the adversary home field advantage, so to speak. Third, it is definitive. Fire from heaven would be an undeniable sign of divine power. The people, loving a good spectacle and seeing the fairness of the proposal, agree in unison. What you say is good. Elijah, with magnanimous confidence, allows the prophets of Baal to go first. Choose one of the bulls for yourselves, he says, since there are so many of you. The morning begins. The 450 prophets prepare their bull, cutting it into pieces and laying it on the wood. And then they begin to pray, or rather, to shout. Baal, answer us! The sound of hundreds of voices chanting in unison echoes across the mountain. The hours tick by. Morning, noon, nothing. The midday sun beats down. The only heat is from the sun. The silence from the heavens is deafening. Their desperation begins to mount. They begin to dance, to leap, to limp around their altar in a ritualistic frenzy. It is at this point that Elijah injects a divine sarcasm into the scene. He begins to taunt them. Shout louder, he mocks. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. Elijah's taunts are theologically devastating. He is suggesting their God is occupied in the restroom, away on a trip, or perhaps just taking a nap. He is exposing the futility of worshipping an idol which is, in essence, just a projection of human limitations. Elijah's goading drives them into an even greater frenzy. In their desperation, they begin to practice ritual self-mutilation. They slash themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed, a common practice in some ancient cults to arouse the pity or attention of the deity. The scene becomes grotesque, a spectacle of blood, sweat, and desperate cries. But as the text dryly states, there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. The power of Baal had been exposed as a fraud. The silence of their God was the most eloquent answer. The stage was now utterly and completely cleared for the final act. Have you ever been tempted to trust in other gods, be it financial security, recognition, relationships, only to find them silent and powerless in your hour of greatest need? The failure of the prophets of Baal is a powerful reminder of where true help cannot be found. As the bloody and futile frenzy of Baal's prophets finally exhausts itself in the afternoon, a weary silence falls over Mount Carmel. Their failure is total, public, and humiliating. Now, all eyes turn to the solitary figure of Elijah. His next act is profoundly symbolic. He does not build a new altar. He repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Before he calls on the God of heaven, he restores the place of worship on earth. This act itself is a message to Israel. The way back to God begins with restoring what has been broken and abandoned. And he does not use just any stones. He takes 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob. At a time of national division, with the kingdom split into Israel and Judah, Elijah's act is a powerful statement of unity. He is reminding the people of their shared identity, their common covenant with the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This altar is not just a platform for a sacrifice. It is a sermon in stone. Next, Elijah does something that seems utterly insane, given the context of a competition to call down fire from heaven in the midst of a drought. He digs a large trench around the altar. Then he commands the people to fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. They do it. He says, "Do it a second time." They do it. He says, "Do it a third time." They do it. 12 jars of precious, life-giving water are poured over the offering, the wood, and the altar until the wood is completely drenched and the trench around it is filled with water. This is not just an act of faith, it is a demonstration of audacious confidence. Elijah is deliberately making the task humanly impossible. He is eliminating any possibility of trickery or spontaneous combustion. He is saying to everyone present, if fire comes, there will be absolutely no question about its origin. It will be an unmistakable act of God. The scene is set. The offering is soaked. The trench is full. The sun is beginning to set. At the time of the evening sacrifice, a traditional time of prayer in Israel, Elijah steps forward. In stark contrast to the frantic shouting, dancing, and self-mutilation of Baal's prophets, Elijah's prayer is remarkable for its simplicity, its calmness, and its theological depth. It is not long, it is not desperate. It is a confident conversation with a God he knows personally. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he begins, immediately connecting to the covenant history. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." He asks for God's vindication and his own vindication as God's servant. And then he gets to the heart of the matter, the purpose of it all. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." His prayer is not about his own ego. It is about God's glory and the people's restoration. The response is instantaneous and overwhelming. Then the fire of the Lord fell. This was no ordinary lightning strike. The text describes its supernatural and comprehensive nature. It burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Think of the impossible physics of this. The fire consumed not just the organic material, but the very rock itself. And it licked up, instantly vaporized, the massive quantity of water in the trench. Imagine the sound, a sudden, searing roar, the intense heat, the blinding light, the smell of ozone and burnt offering, the shock and awe on the faces of the people. The people's reaction is immediate and unanimous. They fall prostrate, fear and reverence overwhelming them. And from their lips comes the cry that was the goal of the entire day. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The battle was won. The question was settled in the most dramatic fashion possible. What is the water you feel you need to pour on your altar before God can act? Perhaps it's pride, control, fear. Elijah's act of drenching the altar teaches us that sometimes the total surrender of what is precious to us is the prelude to God's most powerful manifestation. The power demonstration on Mount Carmel was decisive. The people, awestruck and terrified, proclaimed the truth. The Lord, He is God. But Elijah's victory was not complete. The agents of apostasy, the 450 prophets of Baal who had led Israel astray and sanctioned the persecution of God's prophets, were still standing. Elijah, acting under the authority of Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 13, which commanded death for those who led the people to other gods, gives a stern order: seize the prophets of Baal, don't let a single one get away. The people, now galvanized by their reawakened faith and perhaps releasing years of pent-up frustration, obey. They take them down to the Kishon Valley below, and there Elijah has them executed. This is a shocking and difficult part of the story for modern sensibilities. But in the context of the Old Testament theocracy, it was viewed as the surgical removal of a spiritual cancer that threatened to destroy the nation. With idolatry judged, the barrier to God's blessing was removed. Elijah then turns to Ahab, who has been a stunned witness to all of this. "Go, eat and drink," Elijah says, "for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Ahab, likely still in shock, obeys. He goes up to eat and drink, an act of normalcy amidst the supernatural. Elijah, however, does not join him. His work is not yet finished. He had proclaimed the drought by God's word. Now he needed to pray for the promised rain. Elijah climbs to the top of Carmel, but his posture is not one of triumph. He is not standing with his arms raised in victory. The text says, he bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. This is a posture of intense humility, of spiritual birthing. The miracle of fire came instantly in response to a short prayer. The miracle of rain would require persistent, laborious prayer. He sends his servant to look toward the sea. The servant goes and returns. There is nothing there, he reports. The sky is still like brass. The drought still holds its grip. Elijah does not become discouraged. He remains in his posture of prayer and tells the servant, "Go back 7 times. 6 times the servant goes and returns with the same disappointing report: nothing. Think of the tension and the perseverance required here. Elijah had just called down fire from heaven. His credibility was at its absolute peak, yet now he prays, and nothing happens. He could have doubted. He could have wondered if he heard God correctly, but he persists. This is a powerful lesson on prayer. Sometimes God's answer is an instant, spectacular yes. Other times, it is a not yet that tests our perseverance and deepens our dependency. Have you ever prayed for something God has promised, but the answer was slow in coming? How do you handle the silence between the promise and the fulfillment? On the 7th time, the servant returns with a glimmer of hope. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. A cloud the size of a man's hand. After 3.5 years of drought, it is an almost insignificant sign. But for Elijah, it is enough. He knows it is the first sign of God's coming promise. He immediately acts on this tiny piece of evidence. He sends an urgent message to Ahab: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The small cloud rapidly grows into a furious storm. The sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling. The blessing, withheld for so long, is now poured out in abundance. And then something extraordinary happens. The power of the Lord came on Elijah. Filled with a supernatural strength, Elijah tucks his cloak into his belt, and he runs ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to the entrance of Jezreel, a distance of over 17 miles. Imagine the scene. The rugged prophet, empowered by God, outrunning the royal cavalry, racing through the torrential rain that he himself had prayed for. It is the pinnacle of his victory. He has defeated the prophets, proven Yahweh is God, brought back the rain, and humbled the king. He must have felt invincible on top of the world. He was about to find out the hard way that the top of the world can be a dangerously close place to a cliff's edge. Elijah arrives in Jezreel, soaked in rain and divine power, the undisputed victor of an epic confrontation. He likely expected a national revival, a repentance led by King Ahab, who had been an eyewitness to Yahweh's power. He may have imagined that Baal worship was finished, that his work was complete, and that the nation would be restored. He was at the absolute peak of his power and influence. It is precisely at this point that the narrative takes a shocking turn, plummeting from one of the highest spiritual peaks in the Bible into one of the deepest valleys of despair. What happens next is a brutal reminder that spiritual victories do not make us immune to human fragility. Ahab goes home and tells his wife Jezebel everything. He recounts the story of the fire, the execution of the prophets, and the coming of the rain. Jezebel's reaction is not one of fear, awe, or conversion. It is one of pure, untamed fury. Her religious system has been humiliated. Her prophets have been killed. Her power has been challenged. She does not see the power of God. She sees only the audacity of Elijah. Her response is immediate and personal. She sends a messenger to Elijah with a short, cold, and deadly message. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." This is no vague threat. It is a death oath with a 24-hour deadline. She is telling Elijah, "You had your day, now it's my turn. You have 24 hours to live." Elijah's reaction to this threat is perhaps the most surprising and relatable part of his entire story. The man who stood down 450 armed prophets, who taunted them, who called down fire from heaven, and who outran a chariot, now crumbles in terror at the threat of a single woman. The text says, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Fear completely overwhelms him. He flees. He runs into the wilderness, the same landscape that was once his refuge and training ground. But this time, he is not fleeing at God's command. He is fleeing from his fear. He travels to Beersheba, on the southern border of Judah as far as he could go within the lands of Israel, and he leaves his servant there. He then continues on alone, a day's journey into the desert. The great prophet, the man of fire, is now alone, exhausted, and terrified. He finds a broom bush, a small desert tree offering meager shade, and he collapses under it. And there he prays the most desperate prayer of his life. It is not a prayer for strength or deliverance. It is a prayer for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Let us break down this prayer. I have had enough. It is the cry of someone who has reached the end of their resources, physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion. The adrenaline of the Carmel victory is gone, replaced by a profound emptiness. Take my life. He is suffering from a depression so deep, a sense of failure so overwhelming, that death seems like the only escape. And the reason? I am no better than my ancestors. This is the key. Despite the spectacular victory, he feels he has failed. He expected a national reformation, but all he got was a death sentence. He compares himself to the previous generation, who also failed to reform Israel, and sees himself as a total failure. He had high expectations for himself and for God, and when reality did not meet those expectations, he collapsed. Have you ever felt this way? After a great effort, a project, an emotional investment, when the result is not what you hoped, and the exhaustion and disappointment take over? Have you ever reached a point of such profound burnout that you felt you could not go on? The story of Elijah under the broom tree is one of the Bible's most powerful pictures of burnout, depression, and disappointment. And God's response to this broken prophet is incredibly tender and instructive for all of us who have ever been in our own wilderness of despair. Beneath the pathetic shade of the broom tree, Elijah hits rock bottom. He is exhausted, isolated, and suicidal. It is here, in his darkest moment, that we see the true nature of God's care. God's response to Elijah's despair is not a rebuke. It is not a sermon about having more faith. It is not a reminder of his past miracles. God's first intervention is practical, physical, and incredibly gentle. Elijah falls asleep, a sleep of exhaustion and depression. Then, an angel touched him. God's first act of healing is touch. In his isolation and despair, God sends a messenger to make physical contact, to remind him he is not alone. The angel says, "Get up and eat." Elijah looks around, and there by his head is a loaf of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. God does not give him a heavenly vision or a complex prophetic word. He gives him a warm meal and fresh water. God knows that Elijah's recovery must begin at the most basic level. His body is depleted, his mind is exhausted, his soul is weary. The healing must address the whole man. Elijah eats and drinks, and then, still overcome by his depression, he lies down again. The first meal was not a magic fix. Recovery from deep burnout takes time. The angel comes back a second time, touches him again, and repeats the command with an added reason: "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." God is not just nourishing Elijah for the present moment. He is strengthening him for the journey ahead. He is not going to let Elijah languish under the broom tree. He has a destination for him, Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, the place where Moses received the law, the birthplace of the nation of Israel, the place of fire and thunder and the overwhelming presence of God. Strengthened by that food, Elijah travels for 40 days and 40 nights until he reaches Horeb. This 40-day journey echoes Israel's wanderings in the wilderness and Moses' fast on the same mountain. It is a period of transition, a deliberate pilgrimage away from the site of his perceived failure and toward a foundational encounter with God. Upon arriving at Horeb, he finds a cave and spends the night in it. The cave is a powerful symbol of his mental state. He is hiding, huddled, withdrawn from the world. It is in this cave that God finally confronts him with a question. It is not an accusation, it is a gentle, probing question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God, of course, knows why Elijah is there. The question is for Elijah himself. It is an invitation for him to verbalize his pain, his fear, and his disappointment. Elijah pours out his heart. His answer is a mixture of self-pity, defensiveness, and accusation. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he begins, defending his actions. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword." And then comes the core of his feeling of isolation. "I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." This is the narrative he has built in his mind. "I did everything right, they did everything wrong, and now I'm alone and everyone wants to kill me." It is a perspective distorted by depression and fear, but it is his truth in that moment. God's response to this outburst is profound. He does not debate Elijah's points. Instead, he says, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks. But the text emphatically states, "The Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, similar to the one Elijah called down on Carmel. But the Lord was not in the fire." Elijah, the man of power, of confrontation, of spectacle, is being taught that God is not confined to the grand displays of power he was used to. And then, after the fire, came a gentle whisper, a sound of sheer silence. At that, Elijah pulls his cloak over his face and goes out and stands at the mouth of the cave. He instinctively knows he has found what he was looking for. What does this scene teach us? That while God can and does use spectacular power, his most intimate, transformative presence is often found in the stillness, in the quiet, in the whisper that can only be heard when we stop running and silence the noise of our own fear and despair. Have you ever looked for God in the earthquake, only to find him in the silence that followed? Outside the cave, wrapped in the silence that followed the raw power displays, Elijah stands in the presence of God, and the voice, the gentle whisper, asks the same question as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The repetition of the question is significant. It is as if God is giving Elijah a second chance to reevaluate his situation, this time not from the perspective of his cave of despair, but in the light of the true nature of God's presence. Amazingly, Elijah's answer is exactly the same. Word for word, he repeats his speech about his zeal, Israel's apostasy, and his solitary isolation. "I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." His perspective has not yet shifted. The experience of the gentle whisper has not yet fully processed. He is still stuck in his narrative of failure and loneliness. God's response this time is not a power display or a silent whisper. It is a new commission. It is practical, forward-looking, and it directly corrects Elijah's mistaken perceptions. God essentially gives him a three-point plan to pull him out of his depression and re-engage him in his purpose. First, God gives him a political task. Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. God is showing Elijah that he is still in control of history, not just in Israel, but in the surrounding nations as well. The story is bigger than Elijah's struggle with Jezebel. Second, a military and national task. Also, anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. God is revealing his plan to deal with the house of Ahab and Jezebel. Justice will come, but it will come through God's chosen instruments in God's time. It was not up to Elijah to solve everything himself. Third, and most importantly for Elijah personally, a legacy task. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. This is the direct cure for Elijah's loneliness. He is not alone, and he will not be alone. God has already prepared his successor, a companion who will carry on the work. The passing of the torch is beginning. Furthermore, God directly addresses Elijah's claim that "I am the only one left." God's correction is gentle but firm. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." Elijah, in his despair, saw himself as the last sentinel of faith. But God's view was so much broader. There was a faithful remnant, 7,000 people, hidden in plain sight, who had never compromised. God's cause was far bigger and more robust than Elijah had imagined. This revelation must have been a balm to Elijah's soul. He was not a failure. He was not alone. God's plan was vast, intricate, and moving forward, with or without Elijah's full understanding. God's cure for Elijah's burnout was multifaceted. It began with physical care, rest, and food, progressed to a revelation of his nature, the gentle whisper, and culminated in a renewed purpose, the new commission. God did not leave him in his cave of self-pity. He met him in his pain and then sent him back out into the world, not with the same bravado he might have had after Carmel, but with a new humility and a broader perspective. This journey to Horeb is the journey of transformation at its core. He went there a broken man, defined by his great victories and his great failure. He left a man who understood that God's work is accomplished, not just through fire and earthquake, but through quiet whispers, passed on legacies, and a faithful remnant he did not even know existed. How does this truth impact you? The realization that you are not alone in your struggles and that God's plan is much bigger than your individual role can be incredibly liberating. In the comments, share a time you felt isolated in your faith or work, only to discover that God had a faithful remnant working alongside you. With a renewed purpose and a healed perspective, Elijah descends from Mount Horeb. His first task is to find Elisha, his designated successor. Their meeting is simple and powerful. Elijah finds Elisha plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen, a sign that he was from a wealthy family. Elisha himself was with the 12th yoke, indicating his position of responsibility. Elijah walks up to him and simply throws his cloak around Elisha. In this simple, wordless gesture, the call is made and received. A prophet's cloak symbolized his identity and authority. By casting it on Elisha, Elijah was transferring his spiritual mantle. Elisha understands immediately. He leaves his oxen, runs after Elijah, and asks only to say goodbye to his family. After a brief exchange, Elisha sacrifices his yoke of oxen, using the plowing equipment itself for wood. This act symbolizes a total break with his past life. He is not just taking a leave of absence from work, he is burning the bridges to his old life. He cannot go back. From that moment, he becomes Elijah's servant, learning and preparing for the day he would take up the mantle. Years pass. The biblical narrative jumps forward in time, and we find Elijah again, this time in a role that shows a different facet of his ministry. He is not just fighting idolatry, but is now becoming a voice for social justice. The story is that of Naboth's vineyard. King Ahab covets a vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth, as it is conveniently located next to the royal palace. Ahab offers to buy the vineyard or trade it for a better one. Naboth's reply is grounded in God's law. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Land in Israel was not just property, it was a covenantal inheritance given by God to the tribe and family. To sell ancestral land was seen as a breach of faith. Ahab, accustomed to getting what he wants, reacts like a spoiled child. He goes home sullen and angry, lies on his bed, faces the wall, and refuses to eat. It is here that Jezebel re-enters the scene. Seeing her husband's pout, she scoffs at his weakness. "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" she taunts. "Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." Jezebel then engineers a wicked plot. She writes letters in Ahab's name, seals them with his seal, and sends them to the elders of Naboth's town. The letters instruct them to proclaim a fast, an act of feigned piety, put Naboth in a place of honor, and then have two scoundrels falsely accuse him of cursing both God and the king. The punishment for such blasphemy was death by stoning. The plan is executed flawlessly. The corrupt leaders obey. Naboth is legally murdered, and his land, now ownerless, reverts to the crown. Jezebel returns to Ahab and says, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard, for Naboth is no longer alive, but dead." Ahab, without question, gets up and goes to take possession of the vineyard he acquired through murder and deceit. It is at this moment of wicked triumph that the word of the Lord comes again to Elijah. "Go down to meet Ahab. He is in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it." Elijah, the prophet who had hidden from Ahab, now confronts him at the exact site of his sin. The encounter is chilling. Ahab, seeing Elijah, says with bitterness, "So you have found me, my enemy." He recognizes Elijah as his conscience, his moral adversary. Elijah's reply is blunt. "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." Elijah then pronounces one of the most terrifying judgments in the Bible on Ahab and Jezebel. He prophesies that Ahab's line will be completely cut off, and for Jezebel, a particularly gruesome prophecy. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. He also declares that Ahab himself will die, and dogs will lick up your blood, yes, yours, in the very place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood. This confrontation shows that the God of Elijah is not just a God of power over nature, but a God of justice for the oppressed. He cares deeply about ethics, morality, and the treatment of the vulnerable. Elijah, now a more mature prophet, is fighting not just for right theology, but for right living and social justice. This story serves as a reminder that true faith can never be divorced from just action. How do you see the connection between worship and justice in your own life of faith? Is it possible to be zealous for God while being indifferent to the injustice we see around us? Elijah's life and ministry on earth are drawing to a close. Following the confrontation over Naboth's vineyard and the subsequent death of Ahab in battle, fulfilling the prophecy, the focus shifts to the transition of prophetic power. The moment of Elijah's departure is as extraordinary and supernatural as his life. The text in 2 Kings chapter 2 tells us that when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, he and Elisha were traveling together. Elijah knows his time has come and tries 3 times to leave Elisha behind, first at Gilgal, then at Bethel, and then at Jericho. Each time he tells Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to..." But Elisha, with a fierce loyalty, refuses to leave him, swearing each time, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." Elisha knows this is his master's last day and refuses to miss a single moment. At both Bethel and Jericho, companies of prophets approach Elisha and ask, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" And he replies, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." There is a sacred solemnity in the air. Everyone senses a monumental event is about to happen. Finally, they arrive at the Jordan River. 50 other prophets watch from a distance. Elijah takes his cloak, the same one he had cast over Elisha years before, rolls it up and strikes the water of the Jordan. Miraculously, the water divides, and the 2 of them cross over on dry ground, an image that echoes Moses' crossing of the Red Sea and Joshua's crossing of the Jordan. They are now in a liminal space between earth and heaven. On the other side of the Jordan, Elijah turns to his faithful servant and makes a generous offer. "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's request is not for wealth, power, or a long life. He asks for the very heart of his master's ministry. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he asks. This is not an arrogant request. In ancient Israel, the firstborn son received a double portion of the father's inheritance. Elisha is asking to be recognized as the true heir to Elijah's spiritual legacy. Elijah recognizes the magnitude of the request. "You have asked a difficult thing," he says, but he lays down a condition. "Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise it will not." The inheritance could not simply be given, it had to be witnessed. The ability to see the heavenly was the qualification for receiving the spiritual. As they were walking along and talking together, the moment came. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the 2 of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. The scene is breathtaking. It is not a death, but a translation. The prophet of fire who called down fire from heaven is taken up by fire into heaven. It is the ultimate vindication of his life and ministry. He does not see the corruption of death, a testimony to God's special favor upon him. Elisha sees it all. He meets the condition, and his cry is one of both loss and recognition. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." He is acknowledging that Elijah was the true defense force of Israel, its real army and military might. In his grief, he tears his own clothes, a sign of mourning. But then he sees Elijah's cloak, which had fallen from him. He picks it up. It is the symbol of the authority that is now his. To test if the inheritance is real, he goes to the bank of the Jordan and asks the crucial question, Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He strikes the water with the cloak, and it divides once more. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. The inheritance has been transferred. Elijah's legacy did not end with his departure. It continued and indeed expanded through his successor. What does Elijah's departure teach us? It teaches us about legacy, about the importance of investing in the next generation. Elijah's greatest success, perhaps, was not the fire on Carmel, but the faithfulness of Elisha, who picked up his cloak. And it teaches us about ultimate hope. Elijah's ascension into heaven became a powerful symbol in Judaism, a prefigurement of eternal life and victory over death. He was expected to return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, as prophesied in Malachi. And centuries later, on another mountain, Elijah would appear again, this time alongside Moses, talking with Jesus at the Transfiguration, connecting the law, the prophets, and the fulfillment of both in the Son of God. The story of Elijah, therefore, does not end with the whirlwind. It echoes throughout Scripture and all of history, a reminder of a God who meets his servants on their highest peaks and in their deepest valleys, and who can take us in ways we never imagined, from the cave of despair to the chariots of glory. Which part of Elijah's journey resonated most with you? The bold courage, the honest despair, the need for silence, or the beauty of legacy? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on Faith and Hope.